Oh, King of the Hill Season 1. I am fully choosing to believe that when Aaron Carter, may he rest peacefully, sang about wanting candy, he was talking about you, because you're just so darn sweet. Ultimately, I think that is why the show was successful and was reordered for a Season 2. There is a light, airy, innocent ignorance to just about every aspect shown in Arlen in Season 1. Peggy couldn't even say the word penis, for God's sake. There was an overwhelming trend in Season 1 to always end the episodes on a high note. Even in an episode where it is an ending on a negative note for some characters, like Bobby and Connie ending Westy Side's story by getting punished, Hank and Con end the episode by realizing that taking away your kid's dessert is a language in which they are both fluent. So much was gotten right with Season 1, I almost wonder how much of it was a conscious decision-making on part of the writing staff, Judge, and Daniels. With a more abrasive approach to the storytelling, it could have sounded like the King of the Hill crew was punching down at a stereotype of the American South. However, because our characters are able to show the love they have for one another, and have the ability to adapt to changes, the show never feels like it is being nasty. For example, Hank, Dale, Bill, and Boomhauer asking Con where he is from is a topic that with a more aggressively minded writing crew at the helm could have been handled much differently. Can you imagine if Hank was written like Cartman? The whole sequence would have been different and probably not appropriate for a network like Fox. Authorita! Even if you look at someone who the writers tend to pour a lot of sass into, like Cotton, they still give us humanizing nuggets, like having him acknowledge that Con was Laotian. That's such a cool moment because although Cotton is known for being loud and brash and politically incorrect, we are informed with that sequence that maybe even the character knows that, well, he's a character, in the sense that he is a larger-than-life figure. Allowing Cotton that moment of connection keeps him from becoming an outright parody, and instead allows us as a viewer to wonder if maybe part of his larger-than-life personality is all for show. Maybe there's a soft side to Cotton. Maybe. The writers did a great job of keeping everything grounded, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Watching any show from the start is an interesting experience. Recently, my wife and I started watching Cheers. Don't worry, this is going somewhere. It dawned on me that while I love Frasier, I'm young enough to have missed the Cheers hype. We're only in Season 1, and while the show delivers loads of jokes and makes me audibly laugh out loud, it's clear to see that not all of the characters are 100% fleshed out yet. Having the privilege of knowing what happens much later in the show's timeline thanks to Frasier, I am clued in on some aspects that definitely haven't been realized yet in Cheers. For example, it is my understanding that Carla really dislikes Cliff because Cliff is, well, Cliff. However, up to this point in Season 1, these characters have hardly interacted because at the time of the show's production, the writers hadn't realized what their personalities fully were. Why these two might clash, and what the long-term relationship of these characters could be. The writers were realizing that in actual time as they were working on the episodes. My point is that although our mind is maybe already made up on characters in the show because we have had the benefit of enjoying their adventures for nearly 3 decades, maybe it is better to go into a straight-through viewing and abandon what we think we already know. Magic erase our brains for a second and welcome a fresh perspective with the vigor of Mr. Clean himself. My rewatch of Season 1 of King of the Hill proved this theory to be very true. I've loved this show since it originally aired, but I'm realizing that a lot of my preconceived notions about how these characters are, quote, supposed to act in our brains do not fully align with how the characters were originally drawn out in the early days of the show. We'll touch more on this a bit later. But look at us jumping right in here, like we're old chums at this point. This is way off topic, but in the interest of keeping vibes real, as the kids say, I struggled a bit jumping into this script. I had a lot to say and didn't know the entry point I wanted to take. Look at us, though, doing the thing. Now then, aside from the feel-good vibe Season 1 gives off, I think it can be broken down into 4 main parts. Now, like Bobby golfing, let's get swinging. We'll start with an easy one. Like so many Season 1s of shows before and after, the early animation on this is pretty rough. It's not as bad as some others, but there are some egregious errors. I'm not one to nitpick little moments, but I thought I should mention it. The show in later years reminds me way more of an Adult Swim show in terms of animation. The lines are crisp and dark, animation and colors are saturated and bold, similar in style to maybe a Metalocalypse. It's evident that in the early years they were really leaning on stylistic similarities, similar to Beavis and Butthead. This year the colors are more opaque. Like the yellows aren't as yellow or something. It's not horrible, but it definitely isn't as fluid as later years. Additionally, in the animation department are some minor character differences. All the characters are recognizable, but some of the characters are slightly more jowly, like they haven't quite shed their winter weight yet. Except John Redcorn, of course. He's always dreamy. This isn't something I want to spend tons of time on, necessarily. The animation is worth pointing out, though, but in terms of substance, there's more important things. The talent on this show is evident from episode 1. But it's funny, I don't always think of the King of the Hill cast when I think of the Titans in animated shows. And honestly, why is that? I wonder if a big part of why I don't consider how well the show is performed by its cast is just because of the optics. The Seth MacFarlanes of the world, for example, constantly have clips circulating online from every appearance they make where they are doing their voices for an audience. Every time I see those, I am amazed at how talented the cast of Family Guy is. They so become their characters that it's hard to see Stewie Griffin coming out of someone's face that isn't Stewie Griffin. And Seth created the show. This show is perfectly cast, and perfectly cast from top billing onwards. Obviously, Judge is Hank, but as much as Judge is Hank, Kathy Najimy is Peggy. Their performances are always on point. I'm hoping that maybe we'll get some panels with the upcoming relaunch. I'd love to see Judge and Najimy interacting as Hank and Peggy and as themselves. I'm willing to bet that the banter between two creative people who have played each other's spouse for 13 years is probably pretty rich. And this is weird, I'm having a really hard time finding photos of Judge and Najimy together. Go figure. And look, I can make this video Mauler length, I know that's pretty niche, if I go into how great all the voice performances are. There will be time for individual depth performances later on in different videos. I am looking directly at you, Johnny Hardwick. However, I don't want to stray too far off the path in these Hill and Review videos. Especially for Season 1, the plot lines generally travel through the hills/platters. I'm going to stick solely to those characters for this video because of how central their performances are to the success of the early stories. So with that in mind, Pamela Adlon and Brittany Murphy are incredible. I'm not even really sure that I can do justice to how much they brought to their characters. There's so much nuance and restraint on how Adlon delivers Bobby's lines. Quote, "I'm a little worried about being a slut," quote, for example, is top tier. Murphy, on the other hand, is great for her volume and lack of restraint. Her performance throughout the season colors Luann so brightly, and this is exactly what was needed to cut into Hank and Peggy's shades of beige. Luann is not so secretly in my top 5 favorite King of the Hill characters, and it all comes down to how well Brittany Murphy played her. She will be sorely missed in the reboot, whether recast or the character is retired. There will always be a Brittany Murphy-shaped hole in the new series. I mean, obviously, right? But the emphasis is really on Hank this season. I feel that in later seasons they let the ensemble really ensemble. Because this is Season 1, and in both us viewers and them as writers we're still trying to figure everything out, all story roads lead back to Hank. Even in episodes where Hank takes a backseat to someone else's plotline, like in Peggy the Boggle Champ, the arc of the story still revolves around Hank coming to his senses and realizing he needed to be there for Peggy. Even though seeing the Texas-sized pile of twigs sounds infinitely better than having to listen to Sissy Cobb. And with that being said, Hank grows a lot this season. In some ways, I feel like Episode 1 Hank is incredibly different than Episode 12 Hank, but Episode 12 Hank more resembles Season 12 Hank. I gotta say, Episode 1 Hank is kind of a dick. I'm not sure I'd have the same reverence for the show if Hank didn't develop into who we know and love after Season 1. It's not to say that Hank goes from being the comedy's, quote, straight man or, quote, good cop to being a circus clown over season 1, but more he adapts to how he handles everyone else's jerk-assery. It's interesting to consider, for example, how season 1 Hank would have punished Dale for killing his lawn in King of the Anthill had it not immediately been preceded by Dale saving Bobby's life. His patience was just a little shorter in season 1. You can tell Hank just really wants his ideal perfect life with a perfect family and perfect house, and anything that threatens that reality makes him visibly angry. Look, a perfect segue to talk about Hank and Luann. Luann was Hank's foil for much of season 1. She steals his den, makes the alley uncomfortable, puts a wedge between Hank and Boomhauer, plays cigarette keep away, etc. However, the innocence of Luann really erodes Hank's angry exterior, and he accepts her for not only who she is, but how she challenges his idea of what is normal. Him grabbing his keys to keep the cookie dough supply rolling while she's getting over Buckley is so out of character for him, it shows how much he is willing to bend for her. Luann develops into a mentally stronger character by the end of season 1, and so much of that is because Hank also grows in how he accepts her and starts to really love her as his own family, not just because she's related to Peggy. A huge part of Hank's development over season 1 comes by way of how he accepts Cotton in his life. It's jarring to see Hank bow to Cotton early on and treat him just as how Cotton wants to be treated. Honestly, I was irritated with Hank during Shins of the Father. Watching him turtle to Cotton is so uncomfortable. Cotton made Hank a doormat to him his entire life under the guise that he's a war hero. Be that as it may, it's such a different light to see Hank in. Up to that point, Hank is the curmudgeon and rule follower. He really buckles to Cotton, and Cotton knows exactly what buttons to push. It's huge for Hank to defend himself and his family at the end of that episode. It's a character-defining moment, and one that alters how Hank behaves overall. I'm fairly certain that although he respects Cotton for the rest of the series, he certainly doesn't let Cotton make him a doormat anymore. Finally, Hank really grows as a father in this season. We mentioned how he grows as a paternal figure to Luann, but he adapts to how he typically had handled Bobby pre our viewership to how we recognize him as Bobby's father for the rest of the series. Bobby starts as a bit of a bumbling oaf. You can tell he is growing from childhood to being a teenager, and he's still kind of a quiet, awkward kid at this point. While it's evident that Hank always loves him, he isn't always accepting of his choices. But over season 1, he becomes more accepting that Bobby is who he is, and he is Hank's son, even if it took Willie Nelson to point it out for it to click in Hank's brain. Hank's tirade in the pilot does a lot to cement the relationship between father and son. By Bobby's own admission, he isn't much, but he's all I got. Look, we all knew we were going to get to Peggy at some point, right? So we might as well jump in early. Like a lot of viewers, when I think of Peggy Hill, I am mainly thinking of her moments that irritate me. Snippets throughout the show's history flash in my mind, the most egregious maybe being when she kidnapped that girl from Mexico because she's such an awesome Spanish teacher. And I gotta say, I'm usually first in line to sign the contract for the I Hate Peggy Hill fan club. However, season 1 proves to be much different Peggy Hill. A Peggy Hill who was a good mother, a Peggy Hill who was a good wife, and a Peggy Hill who was a good neighbor. This goes along with what I was saying earlier. We maybe need to drop our preconceived notions on how Peggy acts, at least for the time being. For nearly all of season 1, Peggy is constructed as a voice of reason. Don't get me wrong, there are still Peggy tendencies that we are familiar with. Sure, she's overbearing in Hank's unmentionable problem, but it's because of how devoted and loving she is to her husband. This is a fact that Hank even realizes at the end of that episode. In a rare moment, Hank is vulnerable to Peggy and allows himself to show emotion and tell Peggy how much she means to him. In season 1, the writers do such a good job of having characters keep one another grounded. There are even instances in season 1 that show how competent Peggy is as a substitute teacher. A fact they tend to use as a punchline later on in the series is played earnestly in season 1. The second episode of the series highlights just how good a teacher Peggy is. forcing herself to become comfortable with terms that made her uncomfortable, just so the children wouldn't suffer from a lack of proper education. In fact, I go as far to say as Season 1 Hank and Peggy are officially power couple status. Hank admitting to Bobby that Peggy is his best friend and that she's smarter than the idiots in the alley, that's #goals. Season 1 Peggy gets mad that Min makes her Brown Betty and makes it better, whereas Season 8 Peggy would have just shut down the notion that anyone could make a Brown Betty, let alone perfect her own. Season 1 Peggy is willing to admit when she's been outdone, whereas later season Peggy can't be outdone. Side note, Min is always awesome. She basically is just a joke delivery machine, and she always delivers. The end credits of Westy Side Story when she's telling Peggy to add nutmeg to everything is a personal favorite of mine. Want to add some humor? Add a pinch of Min. Season 1 Bobby isn't fully realized either. He's not as big of a jester as he is in later seasons. My brother used to call me Bobby Hill because once upon a time I was vaguely overweight, doughy, and had a brush cut as an 11-year-old. Personally, I relate more to Season 1 Bobby as someone who is trying to figure out where they belong in the world. Bobby in Season 1 is realizing that he isn't a young kid anymore, but he also isn't ready for full-fledged responsibility. Season 1 Bobby is quiet, awkward, bumbling. His passiveness is again supposed to act as a foil to Hank, because Hank wasn't ever the outcast Bobby is as a kid. Bobby is 180 degree different from what Hank thought he was going to be getting in a son. This isn't a new trope, we see it a lot, but it was good to see by the end of the season they started giving Bobby some space to act independently from his father. Bobby really starts to come into his own with the addition of Connie. Being that she's her own kind of outcast, it was smart to bring these two characters together and have them grow in their awkwardness. Ramping up the tension between Connie and Bobby in the Season 1 finale was a really smart move. Both of these characters needed some depth, and fanning an embering relationship between the two of them was a great way to add some needed flavor to their characters. Season 1 was a roller coaster that stayed on track because it was mainly set in Arlen and on Rainy Street. Little adventuring was done outside these settings, giving us as the viewers the impression that the world of our characters is pretty narrow. Rainy Street in Arlen is a warm safety blanket for its resident. Even when they venture to bigger places like Dallas, they keep the show local to the characters. Hank is still home in that episode because he's with Peggy. And look at the B-plot. Bobby and Luann stay not just on Rainy Street, but in the home for the entirety of the episode. Rainy Street anchors the entire show, especially in Season 1. Also, side note that I didn't know where to work into the script, we as fans deserve way more Dooley. Dooley is a treasure on the show, much like Min, just existing to deliver jokes. The difference between Dooley and Min, though, is that sometimes she needs to become more involved in the plot and less involved in just delivering jokes. Dooley exists purely as a one-liner machine. He is the King of the Hill's own version of Anthony Jeselnik. We get little tastes of him throughout Season 1, and it always leaves me wanting more. Whenever there is a Dooley sighting, count me in. Duly noted. I'm looking forward to where Season 2 will follow the characters. Even seeing Tom Landry Middle and Strickland Propane a bit more will be a welcome sight, even though Buck seriously irritates me, but we'll burn that bridge when we get there. Season 1 was great at laying the foundation for our characters to explore their world more and more. We will be more comfortable seeing what else our cast can get into because we have so much more of a solid understanding of the inner workings of Rainy Street, the home, and the alley. Up next, we will revisit Season 1 once more, but less on a character and theme basis and more on an arbitrary measurement of opinion. Everyone's favorite! Following each Hill in review, I will be making a best episode list from whichever season is being examined. So as to not follow the script too closely, I won't be doing a top 10 necessarily. I'll be tweaking that format a bit to better appease my elder millennial urge for nostalgia. What do you guys think of Season 1? What were your favorite moments? How about what you didn't like from Season 1? Be sure to let me know in the comments below. Also, if you could do me a solid and make sure you like, subscribe, ring the bell, and share this video. Keep your eyes on this channel so we can compare notes about our favorites of Season 1. I love to see that the channel is growing, and I really appreciate everyone that has already watched the channel intro video. I'll provide a link to that in the description for this if you missed it. Also, be sure to follow me on Twitter. The handle is the same as it is here, at Yeti of the Hill. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'm sure we'll talk again soon.